Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Today we have a guest who is an author, person who teaches at the college level, helps teachers become better teachers, someone who writes poetry. I've had the honor of listening to him, and someone that I would consider a leader in the community, someone that is focusing on how to improve society. And mainly, we're going to discuss his background today on this lovely, lovely book. Results May Vary, a novel about the urban high school. And we're not so much going to talk about the book, we're going to talk about the author of the book. Where was his mind when he was writing this? What was an intention? What was his motivation for sharing, for writing, for explaining to us how we should take this book, read it immediately, and discuss it amongst ourselves as well. So thank you very much for being here with us, Michael Henry Haussler.
Thank you, sir.
Michael, let's start with the basic question. As a writer, what motivated you to become a writer?
Good question. Well, in 1966, I was 12 years old. A friend and I decided to write a Man from U.N.C.L.E. novel, if you remember that TV show
It's a
with
spy one.
Napoleon Solo and Ilya Kuryakin. And we wrote it. We wrote a whole novel with alternating chapters about Napoleon Solo and Ilya Kuryakin. It was never published, and it's lost to time now. Neither one of us knows whatever happened to it. My mother was very much involved in the civil rights movement when I was growing up in Boston, and she had leaders come to our house. And so early on, I was exposed to movements in our society for social justice. And as I got older, one of the things I did was I dropped out of college and lived in Europe for a while, traveled around, lived in France as a kind of a vagabond, busking and picking grapes along the Riviera, lived as a squatter in England, sailed around the Mediterranean in a small boat, and kind of grew up a lot and saw the world. And the things I saw made me interested in writing. I had always been a writer. I started writing, as I say, when I was 12. I discovered poetry early on, and I love poetry. Poetry is, to me, the crystallization of all forms of writing. Later on, as I got older, and after I came back from Europe, I became a teacher. And when I started teaching high school, I realized that teaching teenagers was the most radical thing I'd ever done. And I wanted to write about that.
Explain that. Explain that. I'm interested.
Well, so I finished high school in Pasadena and started teaching at a Catholic high school in La Puente. I was fortunate because the high school I attended in Pasadena was multicultural and multiracial. And coming from Boston, where all my friends in school had been white, although my mother had definitely exposed me to the civil rights movement close up and personal. But coming out here to California was an awakening experience. But I didn't even blink. I just went into school and made friends with my high school mates, none of whom were white. And I went through high school and I never even thought about it. They were my friends. When I became a teacher, I realized that the kids that I was teaching in high school were the most interesting students. They came from all over the world. I started teaching in the late 70s, and by the early 80s, we had groups of Armenian students coming into Southern California after Israel went into Lebanon in the early 80s. In the late 80s, we had another group of Russian Armenians coming through. When I started teaching, Vietnamese boat people were coming into our schools. I had a student named Wee Lu, who I taught how to play chess, who very quickly became my master and beat me on the chessboard regularly and went on to become a very good player on the national level. So being around all these kids from all over the world was incredibly delightful, and endlessly interesting and endlessly entertaining for me as a person, who was getting to know myself. I think the most radical thing that happened to me when I started teaching was I recognized that teaching was making me a better person. In order to be an effective teacher, I had to step up and become a good person, the person I wanted to be, because my students wouldn't have it any other way. And that was incredibly inspiring to me. It forced me to look at who I was and what motivated me and why I did what I did and why I make the choices that I make, so that I could do the right things and make the best choices for my students. And it was very inspiring. And I never wanted to look back. And
Your
I've been
book,
teaching ever since.
your book, Results May Vary,
Yes.
novel about urban high school. Share with us what, lessons you learned through life as a teacher and your personal, you know, what's in this book? What's in this wonderful book?
Well, first of all, the book is a true story. The book is my story of going to high school, my experience of going to high school, but it is informed by my years of teaching experience. Because of course, when you're a kid going to high school, you look at school through one set of eyes and through one set of lenses. And when you're a teacher teaching high school, you look at it completely differently. Your roles are very, very different. So it's funny because people who read the novel assume that the teacher, Mr. Miller, is me, but I'm actually the student, Grace. There are two main characters in the story, Grace, the student, and Miller, the teacher. And pretty much everything that happened in the story is true. Of course, the names have been changed to protect the guilty. But I really enjoyed writing it because I was able to tell my story of my experience as a high school student. And yet at the same time, I was able to tell my story as a high school teacher. And I was able to put those two stories together in a way that I thought would be informative and entertaining. The book is rather dark. One of the things I've discovered as a teacher is that our public education system is very poorly funded. And we've got these large urban schools, like the schools I taught in, that don't have enough resources, that have giant classes, and incompetent administrations. And they are peppered with good teachers. Unfortunately, they're also peppered with bad teachers who shouldn't be in the classroom teaching kids. But that's the system we have, and that's what I wrote about in that book. Hence the title, Results May Vary.
As I was reading your book, I kept running into different quotes, and the one that caught my attention was Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I thought that's an interesting quote that you would put in a very political, war-focused quote in there, being that you're talking about teachers and students. So I'm sort of scratching my head and says, are you alluding that to some degree there are some ongoing issues of power struggles and leadership and rewards and punishment, of course? What's your
Sure,
view?
sure. Schools are bureaucracies, and school districts are bigger bureaucracies. So anytime you're dealing with a bureaucracy, you're going to have people who know what they're doing, but you're also going to have a lot of people who aren't very competent and who just work their way into the system. So I think the art of war is an appropriate analogy for that situation.
That's a very interesting thing. What keeps motivating you to write now? I mean, your book is done, it's all put aside. It's available for the public. We're going to give out information where people can find your book. But, given that has already been documented, what moves you now as a writer?
Well, I continue to write. Um, I continue to be motivated to write. I also read a lot, and the people I read continue to motivate me to write as well. Um, there's some, there are some wonderful books that have been and that continue to be published. And whenever I read the writing of a good author, it inspires me to work on and improve my own writing. I'm working on a memoir covering my travels through Europe, my life as a child, my struggles through college, my travels around Europe, and my coming back here and finishing college and then becoming a teacher. I'm having a lot of fun with that memoir. The pandemic afforded me a lot of time, and I'm well into it. I've got more than 100 pages. So I'm very happy about that. I'm also getting close to retirement age for teaching, so I'm thinking about writing a dystopian science fiction novel set in Los Angeles in the near future. I'm still working on the outline for that idea.
Usually dystopian stories are usually in New York City, so let's throw them under the bus instead of us.
Yeah, let's throw them under the bus and have it
Yeah.
right here.
Every time somebody blows up a city, it's always New York City. I think, okay,
Yeah.
not Boston. Okay, not Boston. We'll keep Boston over on the side. You
Yeah,
mentioned
we're
that.
also, yeah,
Uh-huh.
please.
You
No,
mentioned
please.
in this. I think this is going to be a very difficult question for you, but I have to ask it. You're an insatiable reader. Can you tell me your top 3 books?
The White Album by Joan Didion would probably be the first one, only because it's the one that inspired me the most. That book opens with a quote, or not a quote, with her line, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And that's a line that informs much of my thinking and much of what I do as a writer. And when I look around and I look at the stories people are telling themselves right now in 2021, in the early summer months of 2021, on the heels of this pandemic, um, the stories people are telling about the big lie, the stories people are telling themselves about COVID and about going forward from this time period, I have to chuckle, because it's true, we tell ourselves stories in order to live, and a lot of the stories we tell ourselves are just that. They're just stories, they're just tales, they're just made up. So that's a very inspiring book to me. That's a collection of essays about Los Angeles and about California in particular, which is a very interesting state. Another book, wildly different, is The Eight by Catherine Neville, with whom I enjoyed a brief correspondence after reading her book. I was so struck by it that I wrote to her immediately, and we engaged in some letter writing back and forth. This is the pre-cell phone days, so we were actually writing physical letters to one another, if you can imagine such a thing. And this is a book, it's fiction. It's set in France and North Africa. And it covers the French Revolution and the Tassili in Alger, which are these cave paintings in Algeria of these gigantic figures that date back thousands of years. Anyway, it's a fascinating book. And the subject of the book is chess. And I'm a chess teacher and a chess player. So this book is also very, very interesting to me. And I enjoy it very much. And then, sorry, you asked for 3 books, huh?
If possible.
So the third book is The Spell of the Sensuous by David Avram. It's a very interesting book. It's an anthropological book. And it's about why human beings believe what they believe. And it's about our connection to nature and how what's happened in the last 200 years with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the development of Western civilization in general and of people's countries all around the world has resulted in the destruction of the natural environment. I thought that the pandemic brought this out very clearly, because there was a time after the pandemic started and we were all sheltering in place, where you could go outside and you could see nature literally reviving itself, coming back from the grips of the death that we as humans are inflicting upon our planet. Anyway, this book talks about, it approaches that topic through the lens of anthropology. An anthropologist's eye is a very interesting eye because he goes and talks to people in quote unquote primitive societies. Primitive is such a subjective word, isn't it?
Yeah.
And their experience of living is so different because it's still mainly seen through the lens of nature. And we in the cities have lost that with our computers and our cell phones and the time that we spend in our chairs. So that's a very interesting book. And I guess that would be my third book.
Thank you for sharing that, because it sort of gives us a panorama of, who you are. As you said, one of the journeys in life is to find out who we are, what's in our minds, and to be able to clarify what our goals are at present into the future. You fit the criteria for me. I'm making a judgment call here. You're a Renaissance man.
Thank you.
Your views are very diverse, and that's wonderful. It's beautiful. It's inspirational. And I see that coming through your book. Before we go on to the next question, please, can you give us some contact information where our viewers can contact you or see your present and future work as well?
Well, unfortunately, I'm working on developing a website right now. I don't have a website right now, so the best I can do is give you an email address.
Please. And that would be?
Michael in the sea, one word, @gmail.com.
Michael in the sea @gmail.com.
Correct. C-S-E-A, as the kind that you swim in, not the letter C.
You're making me think of the old man in the sea, the Hemingway story. That's what I'm thinking of, the sea.
That's another great book, by the way.
Oh, okay.
That's another great book.
I gotta applaud you. If someone asked me that question, my 3 top books, I'd be immediately babbling here. It would take me days to figure it out because there's so many books out there. This is like, how can you pick 3? There are. So the inspiration is always there, but all the books. And I'm a movie fan, so I've gotten a lot of that also through the movies as well. I got to thank them for it.
I am a movie fan as well. And if you ask me my 3 favorite books tomorrow, they might be 3 different books than the ones I picked today.
That's okay. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have too many than not enough. I mean,
there you go.
Moving forward on that. Serta, I want to pick a little bit at your upcoming book. I'm curious now. What are your views of the future without divulging where your book is going to go, dystopia, etc.?
Well, I think that what's taking place today could be considered a transformative moment. I think writers hold a special position because they're in a position to address this moment of time. We're hearing a lot of discussion about social change. The lens in this country, unfortunately, is very narrow because we're seeing it through this Republican/Democratic contradiction. Even though Trump's no longer president, it's being presented to us as Biden versus Trump. And I think because of our broken political system, there's a very good chance that the Republicans are going to rig the 2022 elections and perhaps even the 2024 election. And unfortunately, I can see a time in the very near future where we may have a president who is illegitimate, who is elected on a fraudulent basis, and yet who is still our president. If that's a river that we have to cross, I'm very worried about the future of our country. I'm very worried about the future of our country as a representative democracy and as a republic. I've put a lot of energy in my life into writing about things that aim for a very different outcome than that. And so part of my view of the future is definitely discouraged by this possibility. But I'm basically an optimistic person. Although I don't really like the term optimistic, I would say I'm a hopeful person. I hope that that's not the outcome that we're going to be looking at. And if it is, I think writers have a responsibility and a job to talk about it and to write about it and to make it known. You know, it's interesting, you know, Daniel Ellsberg, he's 90 years old and he's getting ready to release a second set of papers that he didn't release when he released the Pentagon Papers about our relationship with Taiwan. And I don't know the details of it, but I know that he thinks he could get into trouble again with the authorities for disclosing dirty secrets. We'll have to see. But I think this is something that writers have to do. I think writers have to be willing to step up.
Well, you remind me from a political perspective, if we are deeming closer to troubles in the political world, i.e. dictatorships, totalitarianisms, people in the arts, people, writers, and the poets are the first in line to be arrested. So I think it takes courage to be at the forefront, to be honest about what you see. I know that political cartoonists are feeling a lot of pressure already. And so it's an indicator that sort of the canary in the cave scenario is there. So I think the role of authors like yourself and many others play a very important role, other than just keeping us with stories. I think you're also keeping us conscious. And most of all, I think I heard you say it many times, I think. And I think that's the key to everything, that we keep thinking. Not I know, or I'm going to argue my point that I know for a fact. I think. And I think as long as we have individuals like yourself around, I think I feel safe. When you're gone, then I'm very troubled, I think. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking to Michael Henry Haussler. Please pick up his book. I recommend it 100%. Results may vary. It's not just talking about schools, it's also talking about our future generations. Because these kids, especially in California, the majority are now non-white, and they will make up the state. They do now and in the future. And we're all faced with a common question that teachers say, or educators say: you have to choose between building more schools or building more jails. And they keep reminding us of that. And you brought that issue to the surface. Michael, thank you very much for being on our program. I hope to have you again in your continual work. Please continue to keep us thinking as you share that powerful message with us.
Right on. Thank you very much. It's an honor. Thank you.
The honor is ours.